Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review. We're down to just the last 3 players on the Sharks this past season, and today it will be Sharks forward Luke Kunin. Now, I do wish I could say former Sharks forward Luke Kunin, but unfortunately, Mike Grier decided to bring him back on a 1-year deal, making the same amount of money as he was these past couple of seasons. And Mike Grier seems to really like Kunin as a player, specifically targeted him within the first couple of weeks of actually becoming general manager of the San Jose Sharks, and he wasn't just a free agent signing that the Sharks could essentially get for free like Nico Sturm was at the time, but instead the Sharks actually had to trade for Kunin from the Nashville Predators. They gave up John Leonard, who was an okay prospect who hasn't really amounted to anything, but also a 3rd-round pick, which does carry a decent amount of value around the NHL. So this was a somewhat sizable investment that Mike Grier and the Sharks made into Luke Kunin as a player. What they were actually expecting to get out of him, I'm not entirely sure. From an offensive perspective, he wasn't putting up big numbers with Nashville. In fact, his numbers were relatively small. Perhaps they were hoping that he'd be able to tap into some of the offensive success he found with his previous team and the team that drafted him, the Minnesota Wild. He had a 30-point season with them, but that was a few years removed from that, and so offensively you're not really getting a ton. More so, they were likely coming from a defensive perspective, hoping that he would be able to shore up in that area for San Jose. But if you actually took a look at some of his defensive numbers with Nashville, and on a pretty decent Nashville team at that, he was not very good in that area either. One of the worst defensive forwards on the Nashville Predators. And so offensively, defensively, you're not really getting much. Giving up a 3rd-round pick for a player of that caliber is not usually recommended, but we would see how he would perform in that expanded role with the San Jose Sharks, not going to be playing on, a 4th line necessarily as he was with Nashville. And in that first season, it was difficult to really get much of a read on how he was doing. This is because of the fact that he only played a few games, didn't even get to the halfway mark of the season before a injury kept him out for the rest of the year. It was this season where we truly got to catch a glimpse of how Luke Kunin would actually do full-time for the San Jose Sharks, and what we actually saw was not very good at all. 77 games played, 11 goals, 7 assists, and 18 points. These 77 games played means he only missed 5 games this past season off of the full year, and it was not because he was a healthy scratch at times. It seems as though those words never even crossed David Quinn's mind when it came to thinking about Luke Kunin. Instead, it was just a few injuries here or there. And if you take a look at his offensive output, 11 goals, 7 assists, and 18 points, that might look good on the surface. For instance, if you are not a Sharks fan, you might view Luke Kunin as a 4th liner, and a 4th liner who's putting up double-digit goals is actually quite valuable. But the fact is that the Sharks were not playing Luke Kunin in a 4th line position. Instead, he was pretty much always in the Sharks' middle 6, with time even spent somewhat frequently on the Sharks' 2nd line. His top lineup teammates that he found himself with at even strength was Filip Zadina, a decent enough scorer, but also William Eklund, one of the Sharks' best forwards from this past season. In fact, he spent over a 1/3 of his even strength ice time on a line with William Eklund. And so it was not that he managed to scratch and claw his way towards these 11 goals while playing with other 4th line talent, but instead he was surrounded with some pretty good individuals, some pretty good hockey players, and Luke Kunin was pretty much always the weak link on whatever line he found himself on, and instead just managed to brute force those 11 goals and those 18 points from just having been on some decent lines with some of the best talent that the San Jose Sharks were actually able to offer this past season. So offensively, he wasn't providing much. But as I mentioned, you're hoping that Luke Kunin was going to be more of a defensive specialist, that he'd be able to get some tough matchups and he would actually be able to defend decently well for San Jose. But that was not the case either. Once again, like it was the case in Nashville, he was statistically one of the worst defensive players on the San Jose Sharks. You could even make an argument that he was the worst defensive player on the team. He pretty much always found himself having to play in the defensive zone, not because he was always starting there, he was not always starting his shifts there, but it was just always would move to that area of the ice because he's just not a very positive possession player for San Jose. He's not able to read the plays to interrupt things for the opposing team. He's not able to clear the puck out of the zone efficiently enough. And so he essentially, every other shift more or less, he was on the ice for like a minute and a half, taking these exceptionally long shifts where he's just skating around trying to defend and not doing a particularly good job at it. really the only positive to take out of Luke Kunin's performance this past season is from a penalty killing perspective. And that's not because he was so good on the penalty kill, but instead he was quite average, which is a lot better than the really bad performances he had offensively and defensively. He wasn't the best penalty killing forward on the team. He wasn't the worst either, which is the small positive that you can really take out of here. When it comes to his plus minus, he was a minus 30. That's not disastrously bad, but of course it should also be remembered that Kunin was not playing in those 6-on-5 types of situations, so he's not accumulating those free negatives like other players on the Sharks roster from getting those goals against, those empty net goals against for him. So minus 30 for a player who's, not very good at even strength is pretty much about in line with what you would expect. And then when it comes to his time on ice, this is where we really see that emphasis being put by David Quinn, how much trust he really had, unfounded trust in my opinion, he really had into Luke Kunin as a player. 15 minutes and 44 seconds is actually relatively high, not competing with the big names like Eklund and Zetterlund and Granlund, especially since those guys got some pretty hefty power play time on ice compared to Luke Kunin, but this was still one of the highest in the upper half of San Jose Sharks forwards this past season, got a decent amount of shorthanded ice time as well as a decent amount of even strength ice time. And like I said, there didn't really seem to be much of a justification for that. He was not really having that many good games. There were not many nights in which you said, wow, Kunin was one of the best forwards for San Jose. Instead, there were a lot more nights in where you thought, wow, Luke Kunin was one of the worst forwards for San Jose. But while I saw that, and I'm sure many other Sharks fans saw that, the coaching staff never quite did. And so when it comes to his grade, it is difficult to put a ton of blame onto Luke Kunin as a player. As I talked about in my Kyle Burroughs player review, it is not technically Luke Kunin's fault that he was placed in positions where it would be difficult for him to find success. Him playing on the second line and have to face off against other teams' second lines, it's never really going to go particularly well for Kunin because he's just not that type of player. So I can't give him like an F for that reason, but clearly his grade is not going to end up being very good. His offensive output was quite bad. His defensive output was quite bad. His penalty killing was only barely average, and as such, he ends up with the grade of a D+. Class dismissed.